In this particular lecture, we're going to deal primarily with two important themes put together within the broad module name called Gender and Development. So, firstly, in this lecture, we're going to look into gendered approach to development by referring few of the modernization theories, and also tries to delve into how women in development and more importantly gender and development approach is being critically looked at, particularly from the third world perspective. And we have in some sense discussed at length about feminist movement and how feminism has been linked with environment and ecology in the previous lectures when we were discussing about ecofeminism. So, we are not going to go back to all those, but rather advances by trying to address the issue which is at hand, which have perhaps developed since the 1980s and 1990s, where the participation of women alongside men in many of the different development projects and so on and so forth is extremely felt. And in this lecture, as I said, we will be looking and trying to give utmost importance from the third world perspective. Now, if you look back the way in which when the urging need of this development debate has advanced since the period of when the United Nations development decade took place, I mean in the 1960s, gave an utmost emphasis on economic growth and the trickle down approaches to the key to reducing poverty. So, one of the notable advancement in the debate has been to move to consider gender equality as a key element of development. So, women's concerns were first integrated into the development agendas in the say 1970s, because disappointment over the trickle down approach in some sense paved the way for the adoption of basic need strategy, which focus on the increasing the participation of in and benefits of the development processes of the poor, as well as recognizing women's needs and contributions to society. So, activists articulated women's issues both in the national and international forums, and following these events, women in development movement endorsed the idea of the enhancements of women's consciousness and abilities, with a view to enabling women to examine their situations and also to act to correct their disadvantaged positions, which have been an age-old traditions of how gender roles are being socially and politically constructed. So, the movement also affirmed that giving women greater access to resource would contribute to an equitable and efficient development processes. Now, if you look at the period, the post again 1970s and so 1970s, towards the end of this period, assert the concern with gender relations with respects to development, and there were a lot of micro level studies which drew the attention to the difference in terms of entitlements. Okay, so the entitlements perceive capabilities and social expectations of men and women, this regardless of their sex. So contrary to the unified view or household model, that is, the households has been in some sense considered as an arena of or a space of bargaining, cooperations, or even conflict. So reflecting the norms, laws, and social values of society, the differences in the status of women have profound implications for how they participate in whether in the market or maybe in the non-market spaces, and in the community or the social community as a whole. So these differences embody social and power relations that constitute the setting for the implementations of development programs, and these differences therefore influence the program outcomes. So in the 1980s and again more importantly in the mid 1980s, there has been the growing consensus that sustainable development requires an understanding of both women and men's roles and responsibilities within the community and their relations to each other. So it is nothing but to share the same space or to recognize their capabilities and roles in equal to their male counterparts is in some way what is being encouraged upon. So this has come to be known as the gender and development approach. So gender and development approach is nothing but mainstreaming the women's needs and perspectives into all activities in one primary is one of the main objectives. So improving the status of women is no longer seen just as a women's issue, but as a goal, that is, an objective is being set that requires the active participations of both women and men. So gender and development approach is based on the premise that development cooperations programs cannot succeed or the impact of be sustained if the people affected do not support them. So therefore the gender role analysis is again here important because it sort of examined the ways in which men's and women's differing roles, responsibilities, resources and priorities may affect these project participations. Now one way of trying to look at, as we had discussed, that in gender and development approach is also trying to mainstream women's needs and perspective into all activities. So mainstreaming mainstreaming acknowledges that all development cooperations operations have gender impact and do not automatically benefit men and women equally. So a project which sort of mainstreams gender considers women's and men's needs first as at the country program level and then at each stage of the project cycle. So it ensures that women and men equally participate in every aspect of the project, both as beneficiaries and decision makers. So gender development in some sense moves away from the practice of adding women only components to projects and programs which characterize the women in development approach. Now coming discussing further, that when we talk about gender, we always refers to the idea of the socially constructed roles and that to the relationship between particularly men and women. And in other words, when we also talk about gender equality, it refers to the equal opportunities and outcomes both for women and men, and this involves the removal of discriminations and also the structural inequalities in terms of their access to resources, opportunities, and also the way in which how equal rights are being promoted. So equality does not simply again mean that women should be the same as men. However, promoting equality recognizes the very fact that men and women, no doubts, depending on their biological or physiological structures, have different roles and also needs, and takes this by taking this into account in development and planning and programming, some sort of equality can be derived at. So one can perhaps looked at the way in which how these gender, when we talk about gender roles, which are socially constructed roles and relationship, that is, which are learned and then which perhaps also change over time. So one can perhaps also look into the idea of gender division of labor, that is how both women and men have multiple work roles. So this might include in the stage of productions, reproduction, essential household and community services, and also community management, and also political roles. Now coming to the three theoretical approaches which I have outlined here, mainly particularly three here. Now before that, if you look globally, there are different development models which we have usually followed. For instance, the capitalist, the socialist, or the mixed. And many of the developing countries in the post-colonial period also seem to be following the capitalist model of development. Now my point is not to engage in that, but to rather engage in looking at the three major theoretical approaches to development which have dominated the development thinking, particularly in the third world countries beginning from the 1950s. So modernization theory happens to dominate in 1950s and particularly until the 1960s. So the underdevelopment and dependent theory became the alternative during the late 1960s and 70s, and neoliberalism again, which while not very strictly a variant of the development theory in the real sense of the term, has had a strong and wide impact on both the analysis and policy, mostly during the 1980s, the post-1980s. So one can possibly look at that at a different historical period of time, there were different measured theoretical approach which we have come across. Now, for us to have a hang of how this feminist movement have actually emerges, so we're going to briefly look into this. So when we talk about feminist movement, the implications of the feminist movement in the West and the third world countries, their implications, priorities are again different. So feminist movement in the West and in the third world societies have been responsive to different issues which are encountered by women. So therefore, the economic and social issues have been the primary concern to feminists in the third world countries. However, unlike the third world countries, in the West, it was more, feminism was more to do with claiming for political rights, and it was not so much about the social and economic issues. Whereas in the third world countries, importance or the utmost priorities were based on these contexts. So beginning from the first wave of this feminist movement during the first two decades of the 20th century was largely the result of the white middle class educated women, that is which claims for universal suffrage, or the suffragists who won the vote for the white women in Western countries. So it was more political in nature because it sort of tries to espouse and also claiming for equal wage at par with men. So the period 1960s and the 70s in the women's movement, particularly in the West. So the very termed feminism came to sort of symbolize the efforts to force a collective identity of women, that is to universalize and supposedly sharing similar experiences of oppression, how they are being oppressed at the domestic level and also at the both in the private and the public space. So since the 1980s, again there is the emergence of the third wave of feminism, and which perhaps is given the name of the post feminism, because this new feminism is again more vocal and sensitive to those to the local and universalistic, local and diverse voices of feminism, and also rejects universalistic perspective on a single feminist standpoint. So therefore, one could actually possibly see the shift in how this idea of claims for rights and then the emergence which began in the 60s, 70s, and then the changes in the 80s. Now, if we have to looked upon the way in which how this feminism have played out in the West. So there has been a lot of literature, most importantly in global South, which sort of tries to give a critique of the feminist movement or feminism in the West, because Western feminism was sort of preoccupied and with oppressions which sort of poses two dilemmas of the Northwestern women. First of all, it sort of like tried to assert that the oppressions of women cannot be simply eradicate or get rid of by other political struggles, because these oppressions must be attacked on its own grounds by women's movements. So in other words, it sort of attempts to places women first, that is, and while not placing men necessarily in opposition to women, and rather places their interest and demands outside the space of its own activity. So secondly, the way in which how this Western feminism was being criticized is that although the focus or emphasis is on sexuality and operations, which sort of sought to explain the workplace sex segmentation or maybe unequal access to educations or other material needs. So its recent focus has been more on issues like the representations of the body in, say, pornography and also films, and the phallocentric, that is privileging the masculine nature of Western knowledge, and also the violence and invasions of women's bodies in the families, or maybe in the workplace, on the and on the street, and control of women bodies by the medical, scientific, and legal professions. So even in the entertainment or maybe in the consumerist world, we could actually see that how women's bodies are being commodified by putting them as and one of and by objectifying them in the advertisement, or maybe in certain others as being a brand ambassadors and so on and so forth. So one can actually see how these bodily commodifications and objectifications are being seen in the observable in the public domain. So if you look at the UN agencies and third world, so a number of UN agencies like the World Bank Group, the International Monetary Fund, the International Labor Organizations, International Bank for Reconstructions and Development. So all these have actually these agencies have emerged in a post Second World period, and are actually dictating and determining the development policies and programs directly or indirectly, most importantly in the third world countries. Now, although most of these countries of the world are either member of the International Monetary Fund, or maybe voting power in IMF again is being determined by the size of the members of the contributions, and even when decisions and then the various other powers which is being invested in the IMF is actually controlled by someone else or some other countries. Because by taking the case of the United States as a case in point, have actually about 1/4 of the total in terms of the voting rights, or maybe in terms of the power. So the main problems which is being faced in this period, that is in the post Second World period, is that the fund have because there has been a persistent deficit in the balance of payment of most of the third world countries, and the situations again becomes more critical, because many countries, especially the third world countries, as I had pointed out, usually borrowed the money from the IMF to make their annual payments to the private and the public banks, and also the loan agencies in the principal and the interest which are being owed to those outstanding loans which they have borrowed for different development projects and infrastructures. Now, coming to women in development, when we talk about women in development, it also in some sense amounts to the very way in which how the alternative strategies and also policy options have been implemented to achieve development mostly in the third world countries. Now, in recent years, when we, much of the International Labour Organization activity has been directed towards the underdeveloped areas of the developing countries of the world, in terms of improving their working and living conditions for the millions of workers and competitive disadvantages as far as labor costs are concerned. So out of all these bodies of the UN, the World Bank Group in particular have been paying increasing attention to gender issues in their work plans of regions, and women in development in some sense included among areas that is of special emphasis to the third world countries. So what is important here is also to look into what participation is, because participation has become in some sense a development orthodoxy that is holding on the promise of inclusion, of creating spaces for women as well. However, yet claims for claims to full participations and participations of all stakeholders familiar from the innumerable projects, documents and descriptions in participatory process all often boils down to situations which only give utmost emphasis to the voices of the vocal few and also raised and being heard. So therefore, in that process, many voices of the stakeholders are either being marginalized or being sidelined. So one can also see that women and development in some sense focuses on the participatory development and also about inclusion, and one can also talk about how women's are being made as an important stakeholders and also being inclusive. Now, within the very broad the world bodies of this UN, various bodies of UN, women in development in some sense sought to make women visible, that is they have been an invisible workforce for so long, whether it's in the domestic fronts or maybe in the public space when their interests are often being sidelined. So it sort of tries to bring women in the forefront as also an important category in development research and policy. So the welfare approach was one of the earliest, that is the pre-women in the development approach, which are happens to be concerned with particularly women which are from the belongs to the developing countries during the period 1950s and 60s. So this approach mainly focus on the idea of reproductive role of women, and also does make an effort to meet the practical gender needs through different processes, that is the food aid, or maybe supplementary nutrition and family planning, etc. Because the welfare approach in some sense give importance to the elements of reproduction or reproductive. So even today this approach is pretty much popular, and in the third world countries, though theoretically it is claimed to have moved from a welfare to or development to empowerment. So how do we then try to relate or link between women in development and gender? So women in development was applied to actions that is designed to ensure that would benefit the women particularly, or at least did not suffer from the various development efforts, that is to take a broader view of the differences in behavior expected of both women and men, and seeking or taking into considerations about the causes and their consequences for economic and the human resource development. So the first working group of the Bank Staff Association, which was formed in 1972, focused on the status of women who are working on the bank, that is to discuss the concerns of the female staff, and the group met periodically. So these are some of how the idea of giving space or concern about women vis-a-vis developments have been initiated. So during the second half of the 1980s, again the bank formally increased its resources, and more attentions were being devoted to the ideas which relate to the issues of gender or gender related issues. So basic themes already established, for instance, like the idea of mainstreaming, efficiency, or poverty alleviations, policy making, and then the equity choice of key sectors, and the idea of educations to fertility, so on and so forth. So the way in which the focuses and importance have actually moved on to the concerns which relates to women, more importantly, not just at the workspace but also in terms of the social and economic issues. So some of the recent importance or the recent improvement in terms of the participatory approaches, that is to with regards to development, and on the use of the on the issues of the social assessments, that is how promotions of these participatory approaches to involve women as well as men in project design and implementations. So it sort of tries to give an equal space for men and women with regards to project design and implementations, with regards to poverty assessments, and also a proposed social assessments. So therefore there is an increased attention to gender, more important in the financial services, natural resource management, water and sanitations, and also urban sectors. So what happens is that when women are actually at the receiving end, they are hardly being their voice are hardly being incorporated, or their interests are being hardly accommodated in the policy making and implementations. So in some way, these are some of the recent developments which we perhaps can see in when we talk about the participatory approaches in development. Now, the modernization theory, which we have already outlined, tries to look at that the transition that which takes place, that is from the tradition to modern societies. So modernization theory gives utmost importance and believes that modernizations would be in some sense emancipatory for women, because as the industrializations process, because new methods and technology which are embedded with the modern values and would eventually undermine the patriarchal notions of how this hierarchy have been very much integral part of the traditional society. And also, by giving women an increased access to economic resources. So this is the very idea which of course is being posited by the modernization theory, or how this modernization would eventually lead to the improvement or the emancipations of women from the traditional clutches which they have been there for ages. So in general, modernization theory in some way emphasizes and also approves that the trends towards this Western capitalist modernity. So it is also in some way argued that modernization theory were followed in the third world, that is the third world societies would eventually catch up with that of the developed countries, particularly the Western countries. So between the period 1960s and 70s, the feminist movement again gained a momentum, and the research which are being done by the women scholars focuses on the so-called or pointed out or give a critique of the modernization theory of development, which are being promoted by the development agencies, had actually not had not benefited the women, and in some cases rather have an adverse effect on the women in the third world. So many of these case studies which are being carried forward have ultimately revealed and comes to by arguing that this modernization theory have not really benefited the women of the third world countries, and women had not actually been given access to the new productive opportunities, and technology had not liberated them from the domestic, the age-old domestic drudgery. So gender neutral outcomes had not been led by the market forces, which means the intrusions of markets have not really liberated the women as such. So in spite of these forces of the modernizations, still the elements of prejudice and preconceived notions about women still remained in society. So therefore, the modernization theory with its elements of like the technology, or maybe the intrusions of market and so on and so forth have not much impact on the positions, the social and economic positions of women as such. Now, this modernization theory have been criticized on different fronts, mainly because development projects largely is biased, because men's have really benefited by and large as because of these new developments at the expense of women, and also by displacing women from their traditional productive functions. For instance, if a new technology is being introduced, so men have actually exploit those new technology and resources, and thereby hampering the age-old technology that women are familiar with. So they have actually becomes handicapped, and then in the process they do not have command or control over the technology. So there is often a question which is being posed, that is technology gender neutral? So that dilemma or questions always arises. So these development projects or new developments have actually displaced women from their traditional productive functions, and thereby it has posed a threat to their power status and also income they had previously enjoyed. So when we were discussing about in the module or in the theme natural resource management, vis-a-vis how women are actually facing a lot of problem when the intrusions of market or maybe cash crops are being introduced, because again men have actually becomes a dominant force when in terms of negotiating or in terms of the introductions of these cash crop, because they were the one who becomes sort of like a middleman, and the voices and the interests of the women are actually being sidelined. So similarly, when a new things happens, that is because of the exogenous factors, women are usually being sidelined, and their interests are often being marginalized. So the development planners and practitioners actually ignore women's productive activities, partly because national accounting ignore much of women's work that is within the household and also the subsistence economy, which is assumed to be their role is assumed to be merely a housewife, and credit and other forms of assistance to men. So going by this modernizations model, so the modern economy, which is being premised on the or promoted by these development planners and brought a new resources and opportunities only to men, but left women on the margin of development, that is they are being left out or marginalized in these development processes. So with the result that with this sort of have an impact in terms of the productivity, attitudes and outlook of men and women begin to diverse. So there is a separations which is taking place here. So men actually are in a much more advantageous positions because they become familiar with the use of modern equipment and also learn to adapt themselves to the modern ways of life, while women continues in the old traditional ways. This is from the arguments which is being posited by Bosherup. For instance, the introductions of the green revolutions in India have actually, the post-liberalization period. We have excessive use of heavy machineries like tractors, and then the various other big machines, which are again being controlled, and men are being familiar with the use of this. So whereas women are also equally participated in this sort of development, but they are being assigned odd jobs which men don't really want to invest their energy, and most often their jobs are considered to be something which is not counted as the real job, or unproductive in the real sense of the term. So it was argued that the process of these economic modernization processes have actually marginalized women both economically and socially, and have actually increased their dependence on the women. How women have actually again becomes subordinated to men in the traditional patriarchal society. So therefore these development projects have not really the women's positions have never becomes better off. Rather, they have actually becomes or still continues to suffer, and by being dependent or by being dominated by men. So women's development projects were often ghettoized, leaving the majority of catered by men. So the failure of this modernization to benefit women was attributed to a variety of factors reflecting these different cultural contexts. For example, in the farming, female farming systems in the third world, particularly in the sub-Saharan Africa, women have been deprived access to training, land rights, education and technology by colonial and the post-colonial administrations, whose biased perceptions led them to favor the male farmers. Now, there are also policy proposals which have emerged from the WID and critics, that is, the solution to equality was observed as widening access to factors such as the use or access to tools, technology, and educations. So women have to be actually if they are to be part of these development projects, they have to be integrated to the development more effectively, and not allowed it to pass them by. They should not remain as a mere spectator, but they have to be put in the loop, or they have to really board the development bandwagon. So this has been characterized as a equity approach. So the equity approach again acknowledges women's productive as well as reproductive role. So one have to actually take into account or see things in a much more holistic sense by taking into account the skills, and then the way in which the potentialities, the inner potentialities of the intrinsic potentialities of women are. So it is argued that women have to be brought into the development process, that is through access to development and also particularly the marketplace. So this practice is nothing but to mainstream, then that is to bring them into the public domain. So their interest has to be, taken into account. So this approach has again placed a great emphasis on the wider question of equity, and also on the need to reduce inequality between the men and women. So therefore, what is required at the moment is the redistributions of resources throughout the development processes. So access to resources should not be only unidimensional, but it has to be multidimensional by bringing into account or by making women as a stakeholder. So therefore, there has to be a redistributions of resources throughout the development process. So by again looking under development theory from the gender perspective, so under development theory was developed, that is in part as a direct challenge to modernization theory, and under development theory again arose as rejection to the notions which is being posited by the classical Marxists, that is from a deeply held objections to modernization theory. So towards the ends of the period 1970s, an anti-poverty emphasis has emerged as the second women in development approach. So this was mainly because the existing projects had actually ignored their needs, and women actually generally played the important role in fulfilling the basic needs within the household. So it sort of tries to realize and then give utmost importance to the contributions of women in general. So this anti-poverty approach has actually stressed more on the income generating projects for the poor women, often ignoring their reproductive roles and also their interconnections with the productive roles, and without the emphasis on increasing women's autonomy, which was applied in the equity approach. So feminist academics which are researching on the from researching from a dependency theory, that is a dependency theory which is differ fundamentally with the WID critics of the liberal feminist. So what they sort of tries to put forward is that they argue that the process of modernization and the spread of capitalism was not an inherently beneficial one. Rather, on the contrary, it involves a complex, widespread exploitations, and the exploitations of women in particularly. So within this, it took on a particular forms. So therefore, one could see the rising attentions and the emphasis which is being given. Now coming to gender and development approach, by trying to see it or contextualizing in the third world context. So in the third world context, this very concept of what we have discussed earlier, that is productions and domestic labor, were pretty much observed to take on the particular meaning, because over here greater emphasis was placed on the household, that is the very role of how gender relations have actually taken place, that is between the linkages between the household as an economic unit and also the global economy. So this approach has become as gender and development. So it sort of tries to recognize the very nature or the role of women, and also believes in these notions of how this gender and development has to be located. So this contemporary gender and development emerged as an alternative to liberal women in developments, and this largely sought to give women a place within the existing structures and paradigms, rather than confront and seek to transform gender inequities more directly. So gender and development tackles the questions of inequalities in power, and also looks or give utmost emphasis to empowerment of all fields. So in other words, we can say that participatory development has generally to be linked with all these approaches and participatory practices of various kinds into the conventional development activities. So both WID and participatory development are about inclusion, but on terms and within the parameters which are set by the prevailing constructions of development assistance. So gender and development and participation in development contained elements that recuperate more radical alternative development discourses of the 1970s and their explicit concern with power, voice and rights. So power, voice and rights are the explicit concerns. So many of the feminist and participatory research methodologies share epistemological, ethical and also political principles. Now if we sort of tries to cite an example here time and again, which I highlighted, that the Green Revolution which takes place in India. So with the introductions of new technique or technology such as the high yielding seeds, HYV seeds and fertilizers, or the use of pesticides and chemicals, in some sense alter the class positions of different peasant households, and the amount of productive labor undertaken by different groups of women, both as unpaid labor, that is within the household, and also as a paid labor outside of it. So one could actually see the way in which how the way Green Revolutions has actually tries to bring a sort of a disparity and hierarchy in terms of in the one hand rejecting the participations of women in the paradigm or discourses of new development which is happening. So the gender and development approach acknowledges that in order to address the women's concerns and needs, development assistance actually must take into account, that is both the women's and the men's roles and responsibilities, okay, within the community and their relationship to each other. So one has to really take into account or sort of mutual respect and understanding has to be put into place. So therefore, the GAD approach also, emphasize that it requires the active participations of men as well as women in order to raise the status of women, and also thereby catering to what is being posited as sustainable development. So in some sense, the mutual balance and then cooperation actually is being required in order to push up the positions of women in particular. So the GAD approach is both strategic and also practical in the real sense of the term, and also it starts with the examinations of the issues of power, decision making, work allocation, and ownership and control of resources. So in some way, we could say that this is much more practical in the real sense of the term. So women's participations was actually crucial to the success of the manufacturing industry, that is perhaps the engines of Korea's economic development. So, and many of the multinational companies employ female labor and capitalizing on the particular notions of skills with the payment of lower wages to women, as well as a transforming system of outworking and household productions. So one could actually see that the post-liberation period in a country like India also we have emerges and developed to a certain extent because we have female employees in the BPO sector, the MNCs, so on and so forth. And they did not rely on others, but also earn for themselves, and then at the same time become independent of their own. So in some sense it enhances a kind of like empowerment to women. So women's labor has played a crucial role in the new international division of labor and also the global accumulations of capital. So they have not merely remained a mere spectator, but also becomes one of an important stakeholders in these processes. Now, if we look at the neoliberalism and the efficiency approach of women in development, neoliberalism and policy prescriptions has sort of eclipsed both modernizations and underdevelopment theory, and dominated development thinking since the period of the early 1980s for a widespread implementation of the free market policies and the nature of much of the industrial production in the third world countries. So while appearing gender neutral, the theories have again implicit within them and assumption of a certain gender relations, particular, that is the particular roles of women. So despite talking about the gender free individuals as the basic units of analysis, the very idea, that is the assumption that women are subsumed within the households, providing important reproductive services, leaving to be the individuals and also head of the households who enter the free market and the public sphere. So the major policy prescription following from this kind of analysis is the implementations of free market policies and structural adjustment. So these structural adjustments have again a particular implications for different groups of women in the third world countries, because among others, privatizations of the state enterprise and the reductions in the size of the state bureaucracies often make a reduction, that is in with regards to employment opportunities for many of these middle class professionals, women who often form large chunks of with regards to the professions such as teachers, social workers and nurses. So with the predominance of the third variant of women in development, the efficiency approach, attention has been shifted towards development, that is ensuring development plans are made more efficient and effective through women's economic contributions. So it is argued that this the implementations of this policy or theory, a new equations has to be formed, that is women plus production is equal to efficiency. So in view of the growing economic crisis in the third world, Rose suggested that the continued neglect of women's productivity was a costly mistake that planners could no longer afford to make or take into account. So then gender-specific occupational segregation, that is with the concentrations of men and women's jobs and women's in lower ones, is regarded as stable and a rigid phenomenon that exists in both the traditional as well as the modern societies. So various studies has actually underlined the very fact that the persistence of gender segregated labor markets globally, even within the same occupation, women are actually paid lower wages relative to men, and male-female earnings are actually not well explained by the gender difference in human capital endowments. So therefore, gender discriminations could also be the possible explanation, which is again socially and culturally sanctioned. So although women and development advocacy shifted the grounds for investing on development resources, that is particularly in from welfare to efficiency or from the need to merit. So Bosherup spoke directly to a market conceptions of merit claims and outlines that in its broader meanings, development can carry both negative as well as positive connotations, so enriching a few and impoverishing the many. So the imbalance lies here. So development should actually not be measured by the volume of the marketed goods or services alone, but by the extent to which human well-being is being assured. So it's more a human approach. So development plans and projects would not really be put in place or succeed unless women's potential and also their actual productive roles were recognized. So the improvement of women's life was seen as a mechanism to achieve other developmental goals such as population control, rather than as a valuable end to it. So therefore, gender analysis have also emerged as a new set of feminist academics, and there is now a growing consensus and also a feeling that there is a need to develop a third world focus, that is to understand the gender problems such as gender subordinations and values of women's work, empowerment, feminist ideology and identity of women and others, with locally relevant concepts and theories by taking into considerations the specifications of different regions. So by the NGO 85 conference at Nairobi in July 1985, about 22 activists, researchers and policy makers prepare a document which by enunciating the third world women's perspectives on development described as DAWN, that is development of alternatives for a new era. So Dawn pointed out even that within the first world there has also been those who have been marginalized in the process of market-led growth and whose dissonant voices had not actually been heard. So Dawn was also the view that equality with men who actually themselves suffer unemployment, that is poor work conditions, low wages and racism, because men are also equally marginalized in some way or the other. So within the existing socio-economic structures did not seem an adequate or worthy goal. So we also have seen that the Dawn report again suggests that they should actually go beyond the discussions of empowerment as good for women, that is to the discussions of empowerment which is critical for building accountability into the functioning of the public realm. And that is in some ways the transformations of the gender relations. So Dawn has actually laid that gender analysis in a wider process of development and social change for the third world societies and suggested that firstly they should homogenize women and treating them as a single unitary category, ignoring difference, and secondly third world women are seen as the passive objective of objects of policy and not simply agents of change in their own rights. So third, as a corollary of the second, many of these policy prescriptions and projects are seen as primarily top-down ones, which is actually being imposed from the above. So Dawn emphasizes that development plans and projects would be more efficient and effective through women's economic contribution, that is the efficiency approach of WID. But there must also be equally the bottom-up development approach through the active participation and leadership of women in rejections of the top-down impositions of the development schemes. So some of the implications of this efficiency approach of women and development actually focuses on the more equitable distributions of opportunities and resources between men and women, which will actually lead to a higher economic growth and productivity as outlined by the World Development. So World Bank initiatives of WID again, which started in the 80s, focuses on increasing women's productivity and income. So a study of the networking schemes such as a group which are based on microcredit suggests that these schemes have enormous potentials for reducing poverty and empowerment. So women are seen as we have already discussed when we were discussing on the ecofeminism, that women are seen as closer to nature for their natural procreational functions, and also women are more dependent on nature by virtue of their sexual division of labor, and also in terms of their closeness to nature. So one of the most appropriate participations in environmental conservations again is women. So the Rio declarations at the Earth Summit also acknowledged that women have a vital role to play in environment management and development. So what we have seen in the last two decades is that conflict over the alternative use of local resources, namely water, land, or forests or rivers, have given rise to a variety of community initiatives, and initiatives are again proliferations of NGOs for peasant women and motivated for group actions. Joint forest management is one of them. So new directions have actually emerged in both the analysis and policy of development plans and projects, particularly by the third world government, with the predominance of the efficiency approach of WID through active involvement of women's into development plans and projects. So new areas and forms of analysis are being explored, that is the bottom-up development schemes have entailed a vibrant civil society, which are actually created through grassroots collective organizations. So these are references which you might like to go further, and I have actually drawn extensively my lectures on these sources, so you may like to go through it. Thank you.